joke that's going around the internet. Actually, I don't think you've probably read it, but it's being circulated on the internet where pastors share ideas. And I'm not sure you all visit those sites. And the story goes like this. A priest came in and sat down on the subway, and before the subway train moved off, a man stumbled in and sat in the seat next to him. His tie was pulled down and it was stained with something that had spilled on it. On his cheeks there was a red lipstick, and he smelled alcohol. And it was pretty clear that he'd had a kind of a wild night. He had a newspaper in his hand, and he opened the newspaper up, and he was reading it. And he turned his head to the priest, and he said, "Father, what's the cause of arthritis?" And the priest said, "Well, wild living, spending your time with people you shouldn't be spending time with, excessive drinking, staying out till late hours of the night. Why do you ask?" The man said, "Oh, unbelievable. I was just reading that the Pope has arthritis." I like that story. I like it because it gets at what we're trying to get at today, what Jesus was trying to get at in the heart and the hardened heart of the religious people of his time. It's like we think, once we have a sense of who God is, that then everybody who doesn't see God the way we see God, or doesn't live their lives the way we live our lives, are somehow the people who aren't doing God's will. One of my frustrations as a preacher is that when you preach primarily from the New Testament, which I've been doing for the past couple of years, really is rolling out the stories that Jesus brings to his followers and listening to the encounters that took place in each of the four Gospels with a variety of perspectives. One of the things that's very hard to do is to not be too hard on religious people. Because, my friends, if you read the pages, you're going to find that overwhelmingly Jesus is incredibly hard on religious people. He's hard on us. And, I want to be a good pastor. I don't want you to come to church and feel like you've left being scolded. You are the people, after all, who are seeking to practice your faith. You have some stirring of faith in you, some inquiry, something that's going on, and I want to support that. But when you turn to the New Testament and you look at Jesus, who it is that he struggles with the most, he doesn't have one argument with one Roman. Not one. Not even Caesar. His struggles are with people who are religious, who are seekers in the way. And if you read it and you understand Jesus' frustration, it's as if once our hearts are warmed to the grace and love and acceptance of God, it almost seems that that's the center of our heart, but the outside of our heart becomes hardened to each other. That we like what we know of God, we like what God has shown us about God's love for us, but we really have a hard time with those who, in our estimation, don't quite measure up. So, one of the struggles that have been going on in Jesus' life and in his time was this character, John, whom they called the baptizer. John, who was a wild person. He didn't dress like you were supposed to dress. He didn't speak the way you were supposed to speak. He looked sort of unkept. And if you wanted to hear John, you could hear him out in the wilderness. You didn't go into the temple. You didn't go into all the proper religious places. You didn't go on Sunday. You just went out into the wilderness, and there you would see him. And there were crowds of people who gathered to him, and his sermons, there's a sample of his sermons in the New Testament, they seem rather harsh. But in the end result, people experienced John's sermons as an incredible invitation to hear that no matter how far you think you've traveled from the way of God, there is a future for you that involves an incredibly intimate and loving relationship with God. Would you like that? And they all said, we would. And so he invited them to come into the rivers and the ponds, and there, symbolically, he said to them, I'm going to take you and make you like you're dead. And he baptized them. He put them under the water as if they were dead, and he stood them back up on their feet, and he said to them, now go and live your life renewed and refreshed in the power of God's forgiveness. It was unbelievable to experience that from a man of God. All people knew of God in that time, everyone who wore robes like I wear. When you listened, you could predict what they were going to say. There was always, here is the standard that God has for you, and here's about where you are. You need to do better. You need to do more. To enter into the halls of the religious practices of the time was literally to enter into a place where you'd have to really hate yourself and let others join in it. What a breath of fresh water, breath of fresh air, a splash of fresh water John was for the way in which he interpreted the freedom of God. And people, especially religious people, would say, where does he come off? Where does he come off representing God that way? Where does he get the authority to teach us that God is so wide in mercy? Where does that come from? And the people who were interviewed by the religious authorities would say, nobody has ever reached me in my life like John the Baptist has. Nobody has ever spoken words that sounded like life, like he did. So I'm sure, Sadducees and Pharisees, that you don't think John has any authority to be describing God as so liberal and so forgiving. But from my point of view, the authority that John has comes right from God. And I'm going to live that way. I'm going to accept the authority that John has given. And I can imagine them standing in their trials when the religious authorities would bring them into the synagogues and say, give an account of your life. And they would say, look at me. I'm a new person. I have a life and a relationship with God. I am forgiven. And I am going about the work that God has given me to do. Well, it created such a controversy in the religious community. John was so popular that if he hadn't been that popular, the religious authorities would have condemned him early on and they would have put him to death. Such freedom cannot be proclaimed. People get the idea you can do whatever you want to do. And so they lived with him. And his popularity grew and grew. And the revival of faith and relationship to God was underway. It just wasn't contained. And then, because John was also a speaker of truth, he said the wrong thing to the wrong person. And one of the municipal authorities was offended by a comment that John made. He was put in jail, and through a series of events we can't go into now, he was beheaded. And after his death, John, as large as he was, all the reputation of John began to move to Jesus. People were thirsty and hungry for this word of God which accepted them and loved them and encouraged them to accept themselves, to believe that they could always begin again, to think it was never too late, to understand that the future is always wide open with God. And Jesus began to say, yes, that is my message too. You know, he's my cousin. We're related. And on this day, you won't know it unless you go back to read it, but on this day, Jesus had entered the temple. He had come into the temple where the heartbeat of religious control, where all of the sometimes right and good need to be in control and to have authority. He went into the temple, and as he entered the temple, he found that in the large area of the entrance to the temple, which was to be called the house of prayer for all nations, the religious people had set up tables, and they were using the presence, that place in the entrance to the temple, to exchange money so that you could pay your temple tribute in the right coinage. What I want you to understand is the temple had three parts to it. There was a big open area like this that was open to everyone, Jews, Gentiles, anywhere. It was called the house of prayer for all people. Then there was a little space kind of like this. Our Christian churches kind of try to model it a little bit. But there was another space that was reserved specifically for Jewish people who were practicing the faith so that they could be strengthened in their work of ministry to the rest of the world. And then in the very front, there was a space that was reserved only for God. And Jesus comes into the temple, and as he walks into the temple, and he expects to see a sampling of people from all over the world, people who are Jews and Gentiles, believers and non-believers, people who, for one experience or another, have come to that place in their life where there's a dead stop, and they're looking for some reassurance that God loves them and knows them. In that hall, which was the largest hall of the building, there wasn't a single place for a person to say a prayer. Not one. The Hebrew call to be a blessing to all the nations had gotten lost somewhere along the way. There was no place for the prostitutes, for the drug addicts, for the people who had lost their way entirely. There was no place for them to stumble into and experience that incredible grace and renewing power of God. So, it's one of the most famous passages in the Bible. You know what Jesus did. Get out! Get out! Get out! Get out! Get out! He drove them out. He drove them out, and I don't believe he drove them out from an anger in his heart. I think he drove them out from a heart broken. I think he drove them out because of the representation of God on the earth, which was to be a God who Jesus said, God sent me not to condemn the world, but that the world might find some sanctuary through me. That you might actually find a space somewhere in this hard knock life. One place where you could come and it wouldn't matter what language you spoke or didn't speak. It wouldn't matter who your mother or father was. It wouldn't matter what you did last night or what you're planning to do tomorrow. But that you would find some space, some place, some real place that would represent that there was a welcome of God who knows you, who understands you, even if no one else does. Jesus' heart was broken. He couldn't take it. And he pushed them out. And that's where our story picks up. Because after the temple is cleared, and Jesus is standing as if he is somehow in charge, they come up to him and they say, by whose authority are you doing this work? And Jesus, he doesn't answer. He does a little tap dance. says, I'll answer your question, but you answer this question for me. By whose authority did John the Baptizer give people new life? And they went, okay, we're in trouble now. We're in trouble. We're in trouble because the experience of most people was that in fact the God of Abraham and Sarah, the God who loved the world, had met them in John's baptism. He had actually met them face to face, and no one was ever going to take that away from them. The authority that John the Baptist had was the authority of the truth of love. The truth of the human encounter that says, you are never unacceptable to God. Come, let me show you. Let me stand you on your feet. Let me help you to find your way. I know you want to find your way. So they turn and they go, what are we going to say now? Because if we say that John and his baptism wasn't from God, they're going to drive us out of town. And so after some time of deep consultation, they turn finally with their final answer to Jesus, and they say, we do not know. And Jesus says, yes, you do. Yes, you do. You also know the authority from which I operate. You recognize the authority that comes in the real offering of love and grace and freedom in God. You look at the definition of authority. The first part says authority, the power to influence or command thought, opinion, or behavior. And the second definition, look at the second definition. The second definition of authority is freedom granted by one in authority. They turned to Jesus and they said, by what authority? Who is your commander-in-chief? And Jesus, choosing the second definition, says, I am free. I exercise what I do. I am giving freedom and forgiveness and love and acceptance in the name of the one who is the only authority. Freedom granted by one in authority. Jesus says, you know where this power is coming from. It's so easy to pick on us, our religious life. It's so easy to turn on us. We become so hypocritical sometimes. In our efforts to do what God is calling us to do, we say the right things, we act the right way, but in the end, we don't actually go out into the world and love the world exactly the way they are. The phenomenon of Jesus' life was they were angry because the tax collectors. By the way, I think about this every time I go through a toll booth, and because you live in New Jersey or somewhere around, you might think of this too. It'll give you the sermon some legs. You know, the tax collectors were just toll booth workers. Anybody here work in a toll booth on the Parkway or the Turnpike? I think about those poor suckers every time I drive up, and I try to be nice to them. They've been breathing auto fumes all day long. The bus pulls away and leaves them with a big black puff of smoke in their face. These are the people, that's all they did. They were toll collectors, and they were Jewish, but they worked for the Roman authority. So bad enough they had the job they had, but everybody hated them anyway. And then there were the drunks and the prostitutes, and the people who looked like drunks or prostitutes. And there were the whole group of people that were considered unacceptable in the world. They had a long time ago decided that if what the religious authorities were saying God wants from me, I can't give it, I'm not going to do it, I'm just going to live my life the best I can, and I'm just going to live over here somehow hoping in the end that God will love me and accept me or whatever. They had a long time before said no to what they thought God was calling them to do. And guess who's coming to Jesus? All of them. all of them. And not only are they coming to Jesus, he's going to them. He goes and sits down with them and has dinner with them. He walks with them on the outskirts of the city where no one will allow them into the city. He sits with them at night while they're waiting for their next job. He moves among them as if he knows them. The world in which we're living is filled, the world I travel in anyway, is filled with people who nowadays are saying, you know what, I don't really want anything to do with organized religion, they call it. I don't know, I've been working as a pastor now 38 years, I've never seen it organized anyway, but so they say they don't want anything to do with organized religion. I say, good, it's tough to organize religion anyway. But I know what they mean. And there's a growing community, especially here in North America, of people who say they're atheists, that they don't believe in God anymore. And sometimes when I'm in communities of people who are all believers, and someone starts to talk about the atheists, we all get out our shaming fingers. And we start shaming people who don't find it in their life and in their way to even be able to believe in God. And what I want to say to you today, the sermon today and the story today is filled with 1,000 different directions in which you can go. There's 1,000 different conversations that you probably could have with me and I could have with you about the authority and about the need for control in life and who is God really and how wide and how generous is God's mercy. But here's what I want to invite you from my perspective to think about. I think it's long past time that we give atheists a break. I think we need today, those of us who see ourselves as church-going people, we need to listen more to the people who say they're finding it very hard to believe in God. We need to be providing spaces in our lives like that house of prayer for all people. A place for people who don't know what they think about Jesus or the church or God or anything. A place where they, in our lives, might be welcome. One of the scholars interpreting that I like to read says that he believes that in order for the church to regain its vision, we need to spend hours of time in conversations with people who do not have faith. And not listening to them for what we're going to give them, but listening for what they can teach us. Wait, I thought the people who don't believe in God are the ones who are supposed to be going out and converting. Here's what I want to say. I want to suggest to you that just like in Jesus' time, you leave it up to God who gets converted and who doesn't. And that in your life, you seek as much as you're able to be that sanctuary. A place where someone's sitting next to you on the bus, or someone's sitting across from you in a cubicle next to you. When life slams them with the worst that life has to offer, that you might be, in a surprising way, a place of sanctuary and listening. See, the second child spent a lot of their time saying no to the call of God. But when the time was right, that child did what God wanted them to do. My hope is that for all of us, that we will come in new ways, first to accept and know the incredible wideness and the freedom that is given to us in God, by God in Jesus Christ. And that in return, we might be a surprisingly fresh breath of people who accept other people right where they are. Because God